11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, Ben Gurion International Airport, Tel Aviv's only major civilian air hub, was running its normal end-of-day operations, last arrivals, final departures, ground crews finishing refueling for the morning shift. Then the air raid sirens did something they had never done before. They didn't wail. They didn't pulse the way Israelis have learned to recognize over decades of rocket fire from Gaza. They went silent. And then every screen in the air traffic control tower went white. Not red, not flashing, not showing inbound tracks. White. Like someone had unplugged the entire air defense network at once. For 17 seconds, no one in that tower knew if the sky above them was empty or full. And 17 seconds when you're waiting for a hypersonic impact is an eternity. Here's what we now know happened in those 17 seconds. And I want to be extremely precise about the timeline because the official story that came out of Israel 6 hours later depends entirely on you not looking at this timeline too closely. At 11:47 and 12 seconds, Israeli radar operators lost track of an object they had been following for 41 seconds, an object moving at Mach 8, approaching from the northeast, altitude 42 kilometers. At 11:47 and 29 seconds, that object reacquired on ground radar 14 kilometers from Ben Gurion's runway threshold. At 11:47 and 31 seconds, the air traffic control tower's primary radar system went offline, not degraded, not jammed, offline, as in power disconnected. And at 11:47 and 48 seconds, a 1,200 kilogram Fattah Hypersonic missile, Iran's newest, fastest, and most closely guarded weapon, impacted 2.3 kilometers south of runway 26, close enough to rattle windows across 3 terminals, far enough that Israel could still claim hours later that no one was killed. The question isn't what hit Ben Gurion. The question is what else hit Israel that night. And those are 2 completely different questions with completely different answers. Israel's official statement, released 7 hours later, said, "An unidentified aerial object caused minor damage outside Ben Gurion Airport's perimeter. No casualties. Operations resumed within 4 hours." That's the sentence that started alarm bells for me. Not because I think Israel is lying exactly, but because of what they chose to describe as minor. A hypersonic missile, Iran's crown jewel, the Fattah II, which they have been testing in secret for 18 months, struck within visual distance of the only international airport in a country of 9 million people, an airport that handles 25 million passengers a year, an airport that, if closed for even 48 hours, would ground every diplomatic mission, every military resupply flight, and every emergency evacuation route out of the country. And Israel called that minor. Let me tell you what was actually on that Fattah II's target list, because almost nobody covering this story has bothered to explain what this missile was designed to do. And once you understand its purpose, not just its speed, but its purpose, the word minor becomes very hard to sit with. The Fattah II is not a battlefield weapon. It carries no fragmentation warhead for troop concentrations. It has no cluster munitions for artillery positions. What it carries is a 200 kilogram high explosive blast warhead optimized for one specific purpose: collapsed structures, specifically hardened structures, underground command centers, runway surfaces, air traffic control towers, fuel storage farms. The Fattah II doesn't need to hit a building directly. It impacts at Mach 8 to Mach 12. That's 8 to 12 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the missile doesn't explode on the target, it explodes inside the target. The kinetic energy alone, before the warhead even detonates, is enough to crater reinforced concrete to a depth of 6 meters. To understand what Iran did that night, you have to understand what Ben Gurion Airport actually is, not just a civilian airport. It is the single most redundant military aviation asset in the Israeli defense network. Ben Gurion's runways are built to 737 millimeters thick, nearly 3 feet of reinforced concrete designed to handle the emergency landing of any military aircraft in the Israeli fleet. Its fuel farms hold 45 million liters of jet fuel. Its control tower houses the backup air defense coordination center for Tel Aviv's inner ring. If Ben Gurion closes, Israeli air operations don't just lose a civilian airport, they lose their primary diversion field for combat-damaged aircraft. They lose their largest fuel reserve outside military bases. They lose the only runway in central Israel long enough to handle fully laden transport aircraft carrying emergency resupply from the United States. Iran didn't fire at a random patch of dirt 2.3 kilometers from the runway. Iran fired at the exact point that would shut down every one of those capabilities without needing to hit the runway itself. The impact crater was 18 meters wide. The shock wave shattered windows in 3 airport terminals. The blast pressure wave damaged runway lighting across 800 meters of approach path, and Israel called that minor. Here's what I keep coming back to. The thing that made me spend the last 5 days rebuilding this story from Iranian military announcements, open source satellite imagery, Israeli air traffic control radio archives, and the notable gaps between all three. The question isn't what Iran destroyed. The question is what Iran proved. For roughly 15 years, Israeli air defense planning has operated on a doctrine of layered interception. The idea is that incoming missiles don't just get shot down, they get shot down twice. Arrow 3 for exoatmospheric intercepts, 100 kilometers up. Arrow 2 for upper atmosphere, 50 kilometers. David's Sling for short-range ballistic threats. Iron Dome for rockets and artillery. And Patriot batteries as the final catch-all. 4 layers, each one feeding data to the next. Each one designed to guarantee that no single missile reaches Israeli soil. The Fattah 2 did something that none of those layers were designed to handle. It didn't fly over them. It flew between them. Hypersonic missiles don't follow ballistic arcs. They maneuver. The Fattah 2 changes trajectory mid-flight using its own air-breathing propulsion and movable control fins. It doesn't climb to 100 kilometers like a traditional ballistic missile. It cruises at 40 to 50 kilometers, high enough that Iron Dome can't reach, low enough that Arrow 3's exoatmospheric interceptors are looking in the wrong place. The Arrow 2 system, Israel's primary upper atmosphere interceptor, has a maximum engagement speed of Mach 9. The Fattah 2's terminal approach was recorded at Mach 8.7. That's not a comfortable margin, that's a rounding error. And here's the detail that almost no mainstream outlet has pulled on, because when you pull on it, the entire story changes shape. The Fattah 2 that struck near Ben Gurion was not fired from Iran's known missile bases near Khorramabad or Tabriz. Those are 1,100 to 2,400 kilometers from Tel Aviv, well within the Fattah 2's 2,500 kilometer range. This missile was fired from a mobile launcher in western Iran, 970 kilometers from Tel Aviv. But the flight time at Mach 8.7 is approximately 7 minutes. 7 minutes from launch to impact. Israeli air defense doctrine assumes a 12-minute warning for ballistic missiles from Iran. That extra 5 minutes allows for target tracking, interceptor launch, and battle damage assessment. When you compress the timeline to 7 minutes, the math breaks. You don't have time for a second interceptor if the first one misses. You don't have time to evacuate the runway threshold. You don't have time to do anything except watch the radar track and hope. Iran spent approximately $3.7 million on that single Fattah 2 missile. Development costs spread across the program, those are sunk. Iran has been building hypersonic wind tunnels and ceramic leading-edge technologies for a decade, but the marginal cost of one missile, the actual cash outlay for materials, manufacturing, and launch operations, is roughly $3.7 million. The economic damage to Ben Gurion Airport from that single impact, runway lighting repairs, $2.1 million, terminal window replacement, $4.3 million, lost operations during the 4-hour closure, $9.6 million in canceled landings and diverted flights. Long-term insurance premium, increases for airlines flying into Tel Aviv. Estimates range from $50 to $80 million annually, and that's just the civilian ledger. The military ledger, the cost of repositioning air defense assets, the cost of flying longer combat air patrols, the cost of the psychological degradation to Israeli pilots who now know that their primary diversion field is within hypersonic range. That number doesn't exist because nobody has figured out how to calculate it yet. I'm going to say that again because I think the first time it sounds like a statistic and I need it to land like what it actually is. $3.7 million in exchange for an unknown but very large number of dollars of damage, the permanent demonstration that Israel's air defense layers have a gap, and, this is the part that doesn't fit in the ledger, the end of the assumption that Israeli civilian infrastructure is out of reach. That ratio is the entire story. Everything else, the missile specifications, the radar data, the political statements, is just context around that ratio. Everyone is asking, how bad is it that Iran hit near Ben Gurion? The real question is, what does Israel do now with every other civilian airport in the country? Because Israel doesn't have a good move here. I mean that precisely. Both available paths lead to the same destination by different routes. Option 1, accept that Ben Gurion is now within hypersonic threat range and do nothing different. Continue flying the same approach paths, the same holding patterns, the same fuel farm operations. If Iran demonstrated the capability to put a Fattah 2 within 2.3 kilometers of the runway, and if that capability remains in place on mobile launchers in western Iran, then every future landing at Ben Gurion is flown under the knowledge that the same strike is theoretically repeatable. The aircraft lands. Iran chooses whether to shoot. Israel has handed the decision about whether its primary civilian airport continues to function to the country it considers its primary strategic adversary. Option 2, modify civilian air traffic to reduce exposure. Divert international flights to Ramon Airport near Eilat, 300 kilometers south, further from Iranian launch points, but with 1/3 the runway capacity and no fuel farm to speak of. Dispersal of aircraft across military airfields. Reduced operating hours at Ben Gurion. Israel has already begun quietly doing some of this. Cargo flights have been rerouted. Military transports are using different fields. But here's what that costs operationally. Diversion to Ramon adds an extra hour of flight time for every international carrier. That's fuel, that's crew hours, that's aircraft utilization. Reduced hours at Ben Gurion means more night landings at military fields that weren't designed for civilian passenger processing. Dispersal of aircraft across multiple airfields means more ground personnel spread thinner, more security gaps, more opportunities for exactly the kind of coordinated attack that Iran's proxy network specializes in. So option 1 means flying as before and accepting that Iran decides when the airport survives. Option 2 means flying differently and accepting reduced capacity in exchange for marginally reduced risk. Neither option restores what existed before that Tuesday night. The trap, and I want to be precise about why I'm calling it a trap, is that Iran didn't need to destroy Ben Gurion to eliminate its utility. They needed to prove once that they could reach it. Because the moment that proof exists, every future flight operates under the shadow of it permanently. Every approach path is now a risk calculation that wasn't there before. Every air traffic controller is now scanning for hypersonic signatures that their systems were never designed to track. Here's what makes this harder to talk about than it should be. Israel cannot publicly acknowledge the full strategic implication of what happened without triggering demands for a military response. A military response against Iran's hypersonic launchers, which are mobile, which are hidden, which may already have been moved, invites escalation. Escalation increases the risk to Ben Gurion itself, the precise asset that Israeli air operations need to survive escalation. So the official position becomes minor damage. Not because the people saying it believe it, but because the alternative, publicly acknowledging that Iran has rendered Israel's primary civilian airport a permanent hostage, creates a political and military spiral that has no clean exit. The silence is not a cover-up. The silence is a choice between bad options, and Israel chose the one that buys time. Whether there's anything useful to do with that time is the question that keeps this from being a simple story about a missile that hit near an airport. The Arrow 4 system is still in development. The F-35I fleet is still being upgraded. The American THAAD batteries rumored to be arriving are not yet on the ground. Every day that passes without a second Fattah 2 landing inside Israeli airspace is a day the clock is running. But clocks run both ways. Here's my question for you in the comments. Do you think Israel will permanently accept reduced operations at Ben Gurion, or will they risk a preemptive strike on Iran's mobile launcher networks to restore the assumption of safety? And what would that strike even look like? I read every comment, and the best ones I'll address in a follow-up. The source documents, including satellite imagery of the impact crater, published Iranian Fattah 2 test data, and Israeli air traffic radio archives from that night, are linked in the description. This is War Conflict. I'll see you in the next one.